Okay, first to return to our first seminar of the course, the end of history, we looked at Francis Fukuyama's famous 1989 end of history thesis, where he claims that liberal political rights, a liberal political system matched with market capitalism, is in some sense the end point of the evolution of society. He's got a very particular reason for that, which we'll talk about. Instead of trying to work out whether he was right or wrong in the seminar, we really just engaged with his language and his key concerns to try to develop some key ideas and debates within liberalism. Before turning to some of the details on this slide, I think it might be useful for me to make some introductory comments about what liberalism is itself, because a number of you have been expressing concerns that you really just don't understand what liberalism is itself, which is obviously surprising given that we are living in a liberal society. But I guess it's like asking a fish what water's like. A fish is likely to say, well, I don't understand the question. What's water? So, I just called you all fish. I didn't mean to do that. You're not fish. Okay, but I want to make some introductory comments on what liberalism is. Fundamentally, foundationally, at all times, liberalism is a commitment to maximizing the freedom of the individual within a society. So the foundational problematic of liberal political philosophy is how do we best maximize the freedoms of the individual? We're actually going to return to this formula, this problematic, when we talk about John Rawls later today. Okay, so while there are many different liberalisms, both in terms of ideation, just simple ideology, but also in terms of lived reality, there are many different types of liberal society that we can identify in history and around the world today. But what unifies them is a commitment to maximizing the freedom of the individual. Secondly, I've said just a slide ago that liberalism is that political ideology which sets itself against feudalism. And we can understand liberalism historically as a program of emancipation from the strictures of feudalism. In order to make sense of that, we probably need to know a bit more about feudal society. By feudalism, I'm referring to the Western European feudal societies of the Dark and Middle Ages. So Britain, France, the Netherlands, the Prussian city-states, etc., the Prussian principalities from the 10th through to the 15th and 16th centuries. And we are talking there about societies which are highly stable and highly hierarchical. Hierarchical in terms of a class structure. There is a monarch sitting atop the hierarchy, a relatively weak monarch, I would say, by the standards of the modern state, but a monarch sitting atop a hierarchy, below him a class of land-owning nobility, and below the nobility a large mass of people who own no land and are forced to work the land owned by nobles in order to survive. And these agricultural workers have rights to a small amount of land, owned, as I say, by a noble family. They have rights to a certain amount of land, a small holding within that, and they get to keep a proportion of what they grow each year in order to allow for themselves and their families to subsist, and then everything else gets given to the nobility, the nobleman who owns the land. And it's very difficult for these agricultural workers to leave this arrangement. There's no developed employment markets in the economy. There's very little waged labor in these economies. So it would be very difficult to leave your land as an agricultural worker and find a livelihood somewhere else. So in a sense, these workers are indentured, or they're what we would call serfs. And that means that the relationship between the agricultural worker and the landowner is not just an economic one, but it's also a social one. And we can say that a feudal system is one defined by a system of rights and laws that apply to different members of a society according to where they exist within this hierarchy. Liberalism is an opposition to this situation. Liberalism is that type of society defined by the equality of all citizens before the law. Formal equality. We're going to talk about equality a lot today. But we could say that liberalism is that type of society defined by equality of all citizens before the law. A society where privilege, a word literally meaning private law, is outlawed. And as I said a couple of slides ago, this is a very radical proposition. The liberal thinkers who are developing these ideas in the context of feudal societies are definitely thought of as radical thinkers. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Jefferson, the people that we're going to mention in a bit, are coming up with big new ideas for a new type of society. Okay, so it's tempting to imagine that that the transition to these liberal societies, the transition from feudal to liberal societies, is a very swift and dramatic one. Certainly, in the cases of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, we are talking about radical junctures. And these are junctures that call into existence entire new societies, that write into existence new societies, and write these societies into existence explicitly on the grounds of liberal principles. The French commitment to liberty, equality, and fraternity. The American commitment in the Declaration of Independence that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. These are clearly liberal ideas. Apologies about the baby crying in the background. I'll fix that and then... never mind. I'll just fix it. I'll finish this slide. So, while it's tempting to narrate the birth of liberal societies as dramatic moments of rupture, I think it's much more accurate to say that the development of liberal ideas and the transition of societies out of feudalism into liberalism is a very slow, piecemeal process. I think you can trace the ideas of liberalism back to Thomas of Aquinas, the 13th century Italian priest, who's writing in like the 1240s, 1250s about the fact that human beings are intrinsically moral, that someone born as a slave is born morally equal to someone born free, that human beings left to their own devices will act morally. So for example, the scholastics, Thomas of Aquinas' followers, go out into the world and start exploring societies outside of Christendom, non-Christian societies, and are shocked to find that these societies are not defined by anarchy. Coming from a feudal Christian society, they imagine that order is bestowed by strong commitment to this hierarchy, strong commitment to everyone knowing their place within society, and commitment to Christian values and things like that. But they go to places like India and China and find that people are all non-Christian and are living in relatively ordered societies. And they're forced to. The scholastics that I'm talking about, it's quite a long divergence, but they start to think that a shaking of the hierarchy would not actually create disorder, and increases in the freedom of citizens might actually produce self-containing, self-perpetuating orders within society themselves. And this, later on in the late 18th century, this is going to be formalized by the first liberal economists, people like Adam Smith, who have lines about the fact that everyone pursuing their own interests economically actually benefits everyone together. It produces a system, a self-perpetuating economic system itself, and so on. We're going to see those ideas. Okay, but fundamentally we've got two foundational definitions of liberalism. One is a commitment to the maximization of the freedom of the individual. The second is a ambition to emancipate society from the strictures of feudalism, and specifically that means the outlawing of private law, of privilege, and the formal equality of all citizens before the law, before a common public law. Okay, that's the evolution of the ideas. We can also say the evolution of the states themselves takes a very, very long time. The monarchy in the 12th, 13th, 14th century, as I say, is very weak. It takes many centuries for the development of modern state apparatuses and the requirements of colonization and the requirements of prosecuting the Napoleonic Wars and other very large wars on a scale that had never been seen before, that call forth the modern massive state apparatuses, the modern bureaucracies that we associate today with modern liberal states and what we might call the Weberian state. And this is a very gradual process, a negotiation between different factional elements, between different classes, the development of new types of worker professionals who demand a wage and work in the cities as opposed to remaining on land as on agricultural land as indentured workers, and all these things take a very, very long period of time. I think it's best to understand the transition to liberal society is happening in this very slow, piecemeal way. Okay, so what we tried to do in the first seminar, really quickly, was differentiate, try to make sense of some of the contradictions within liberal societies. I think the history that I've given just then and the idea that the transition from feudalism to liberalism occurred in a very slow, piecemeal way is definitely required to understand some of the contradictions that exist in liberal societies today. Obviously, the head of state in Australia, as the UK, is a monarch. This is crazy within liberalism. Like if I do a really great job, if one of us does a very good job and excels in our particular field, we get a prize bestowed upon us by a queen, and this is someone who has this power to say you're excellent, not by dint of her doing anything excellent herself and earning the respect through her achievements, but rather by being born the queen. Okay, this is a contradiction, but in the case of the UK, there isn't a radical moment where we end monarchy, we end feudalism and start liberalism. There's a process of hundreds of years. Likewise, I would say that the evolution of liberal ideas is gradual and is often incoherent. And what I tried to do in the first seminar is to suggest to you that there are two very important lineages of liberal ideology, a Hegelian one and an Enlightenment one. The Enlightenment understanding of liberalism is one which understands the human being as rational, capable of communication, self-interested and creative. Someone who is able to engage with the world in a creative way to use the intelligence and insights of a naturally inquiring mind to improve one's own livelihood. And within this understanding, we're talking about people like Rousseau and Locke, people like that, Enlightenment thinkers. Within this understanding of liberalism, the main concern, the main problematic is to understand what the relationship is between the governed and the governor, the governed subject and the governor. And the innovation of these liberal thinkers is to say that it's a two-way relationship, that the governor is not ultimately powerful, but actually is powerful insofar as the governed citizens allow him to be powerful, and that the governor has obligations, that there are limits on the power and what the governor is allowed to do. Which is ultimately to say that we're talking about a relationship between a set of actors, citizens in a society, and a governor, and that relationship is one defined by negotiation, and it can change through time. We can bandy off different rights against one another in order to reach a settlement of rights and obligations, mutual rights, mutual obligations, where both parties are happy. The Hegelian understanding of liberalism is very, very different. Instead of understanding the human being as essentially intelligent and creative and capable of communication, the Hegelian understanding of the human being is one of an essential intrinsic dignity. So the human being has in his or her essence a spirit that marks him apart from other types of matter and other types of animal. And that spirit imbues him with intrinsic rights. The right to life, the right to pursue happiness, the right to self-betterment, etc. And freedom for this Hegelian understanding and rights are not the tools, the instruments by which the individual citizen pursues his or her interest, but rather the expression of this intrinsic humanness, the nous that is within each of us. That is to say that Hegel produces an understanding of the human being which is not defined by intellect, but rather by spirit and a view of the world that is essentially moralistic. Fukuyama's thesis is that capitalism matched with liberal democracy is the best system possible in terms of enabling the recognition of individuals, of human beings recognizing each other's intrinsic, inherent dignity, and that no system can be imagined. No one has invented a system or produced a set of principles for a society that would allow this recognition of intrinsic worth of each individual greater than liberalism. And the point of the seminar was to say that neither of these visions of what the human being is, of what liberalism is about, or what the purpose of it is, have won out. Actually, they're both present today. We have both an Enlightenment understanding of the human being and of liberal society, and a Fukuyamist, or a Hegelian Fukuyamist understanding of what the human being is and what the purpose of liberal society is. And these are just mixed awkwardly together, and the contradictions between the two are not resolved neatly. They are available as political resources for different actors to draw on as and when they will. We didn't get to talk much about where Fukuyama has gone with these ideas himself, but in 2019 he wrote a book reflecting on the ideas 30 years on, and basically suggested that while the basic principles have held up pretty well, and he basically thinks the end of history thesis argument is valuable and strong, that he may have underestimated human beings' desire not only to be recognized as of equal dignity, but actually sometimes recognized as better than one another. And that this desire, this intrinsic desire to compete with one another and to be recognized as superior in some senses is a very powerful driver of conflict. So while we might have reached the end of history, we very much haven't reached the end of conflict, and we would expect conflict to be ever present within the human condition, within any sort of society that we developed. Interesting if you can go that way. I've spoken for a very long time, but I think it's useful to do some foundational work on what liberalism is. I'll be much shorter on the other two slides, I promise.